Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Locals, as well as supporting me on Buy Me a Coffee, Locals, and Subscribe Star. Now, I had forgot that Logos had told me last week that he would be busy this weekend, so he will not be with us tonight. We will all miss Executioner Logos, but we have a Moldbug show to do. And last week I had announced that Charlemagne had intended to do a Moldbug show on last Sunday with me as a guest. That didn't happen. Somebody got sick, but it looks like, as far as I can tell, everybody's confirmed for tomorrow. So tune in to Charlemagne tomorrow, where I'll be on for some more Moldbug action. So that'll be fun. I see we have Stephen Malcolm and Minoan in the chat already, and Censored Anon. Hello. Okay. Statistical analysis moons the bull, mentions Moldbug September 1st, 2007. I just have to say, everybody watching, how the heck are we still in his first year? This is still only 2007. I don't know how Logo said I could put in all this time, and it's only 2007 still. Moldbug just, I don't know. There's an intelligent article on statistical prediction in the FT this morning. The FT firewalls articles after a day, so I suspect this link will break unless you are an FT subscriber. I want to quote some chunks of the article, not because it's smart, but because it's one of the most embarrassing essays to ever appear in print. The troubles that the author Ian Irays is pimping a new book, and the FT article is adapted from that book. Since the book was not written in the last month, it says things about the financial markets that, in light of recent events, are at best grimly hilarious. Presumably, if you were a national security pundit, you'd have a book release scheduled for October 2001, and your book observed the threat of terrorism was overheated propaganda turned out by a cabal of neoconservative wingnuts. Your publisher would have the sense to pull the book, or at least hold it until 2005 or so. You'd think that the FT editor could at least have done a quick snip on this graph. Since the 1950s, social scientists have been comparing the predictive accuracies of number crunchers and traditional experts, and finding that statistical models consistently outpredict experts. But now that the revolution has become a revolution in which companies, investors, and policymakers use analysis of huge databases to discover empirical correlations between seemingly unrelated things, want to hedge a large purchase of euros, turns out you should sell a carefully balanced portfolio of 26 other stocks and commodities that might include some shares in Walmart. Sure, while your hedge funds to go belly up and explode like a rotting whale, raining putrid financial instruments all over Connecticut, turns out that sounds like what happened with the Fed a little later that year. Or not the Fed, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the housing market. But turns out you should assume financial markets are stochastic systems in which the future mirrors the past. Apparently, some things that are seemingly unrelated are actually unrelated. Turns out you should assume that's literally the stupidest thing I ever heard. And the last 15 years have showed us that they're not stochastic. In fact, people who make predictions on markets, assuming this is before the housing crash of 2007, just get screwed. Like, they're not as stable as people think they are. And, we're seeing it now. Now, again, you could say, well, how could Moldbug know? Well, there was a dot-com bubble of 2001. So it's not like this was completely unforeseen. As one guest on Brad Strusser's blog, the most Isley of the macro finance geek, but see also macro man, Nihan Cassandra, Winterplant, Waldman, and Helasius writes, it seems like there are 2 points of view running through this blog. The securitization process was fundamentally flawed. The process wasn't flawed, but buyers weren't prepared for predictable downgrades. Two fish. You have a CDO that's divided into 3 tranches. Let's call them high risk, medium risk, and low risk. Everyone knows that the high risk CDO will lose money. The question is how much. You do the calculation, and it shows that the low risk tranche has a 2% chance of losing money. But the latter sentence is a prediction about the future. This prediction is based on assumptions, e.g., X% of the underlying loan will behave like this population of loans on which we have historical data. The models only address correlations between the different cash flows to the degree that their assumptions about the behavior of the underlying mortgages are correct. The problem is times change, behaviors change. It's hard for some of us to believe that models that predict historical data can hope to give reliable predictions about future events. If the models are only a little wrong and the modelers would have taken this into account, you have a good CDO. If the models are a lot wrong, you have a lemon. It seems that the people who believe 1 think that the models are likely to be wildly off the mark, while the people who believe 2 think the models are basically sound. The problem I have with 2 is this. If in fact the process by which CDOs were created is fundamentally sound, why aren't people in the know making a killing buying CDOs up right now? Indeed, Bueller. Fortunately, at least the financial markets are not Professor Ayer's leading example, but instead he opens his article with the precious art of automastic idiocy. As the men talked, they decided to run a horse race to create a friendly interdisciplinary competition to compare the accuracy of 2 different ways to predict the outcome of Supreme Court cases. In one corner stood the predictions of the political scientists and their flowcharts, and in the other the opinions of 83 legal experts, esteemed law professors, practitioners, and pundits who would be called upon to predict the justices' votes for cases in their areas of expertise. The assessment was to predict in advance the votes of individual justices for every case that was argued in the Supreme Court's 2002 term. The experts lost. For every argued case during the 2002 term, the model predicted 75% of the court's affirm reverse results correctly, while the legal experts collectively got only 59.1% right. The computer was particularly effective at predicting the crucial swing vote of Justice O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy. The model predicted O'Connor's vote correctly 70% of the time, while the expert success rate was only 61%. Now, why is this not surprising? It's not surprising because a good professor is testing the model against the survey. In other news, Professor Ayers is a world-class marathoner in a 26.2-mile race. He can outperform my grandmother. Although, considering the intellectual honesty that this exercise demonstrates, he'd probably feel the need to walk her as she shambled past. If our esteemed professor were actually to establish a prediction market in which people could make actual money by predicting Supreme Court decisions, he could actually pit the best models against the best experts, as selected not by a secretary but by an adaptive system, which rewards successes and punishes failure. Heck, if he has a good model, he could actually make some scratch in the game. Maybe he could even detach himself. Yeah. Let's see. Now, why hasn't anyone done this? At least I get no useful hits when I Google search Supreme Court and predictive markets. Perhaps because, as I suspect, the market would have error rates well under 10%. Perhaps because if you have a career as a crusader for social justice, general purpose media whore, and perpetual Fedco flack, constructing an experimental design to demonstrate the essentially comic nature of the Rotary System's most revered agency, the Inspection Council, isn't the idea that leaps instantly to mind, I'm guessing here. If you need a pop science book about modeling and prediction, try David Orell's The Future of Everything. Orell, who was actually a mathematician, does not have a whole lot to say, except that it's a really bad idea to trust the model. As Orell's namesake once put it, trust a snake before a Jew and a Jew before a Greek, but don't trust an Armenian. Hopefully by the end of Orell's book, you will trust a whole clan of snake-handling Greco-Jewish Armenians before you assume that a correctly balanced portfolio of 26 other stocks and commodities will mirror the fluctuation of the euro. If you're more interested in the financial end of this, I haven't finished Rick Bookstaber's book, but so far I like it. A little Austrian economics would do Bookstaber a large passel of good, but his blowing up the lab essay in Time is as good an introduction to the CDO disaster as I've seen so far. Gary Larson's First Sight anthology has its cover, what I think is actually the best Far Side cartoon ever. Note, however, the idiot photographers are only sticking their tongues out of the bull. They have not actually turned around and mooned it as the Professor Ayers just had. Hopefully he's already consigned his royalties to Goldman's Global Alpha Fund, which after 3 25 Sigma events in 3 days could certainly use the cash. So, trying to piece this together, it seems that Moldbug doesn't like it when political scientists and such pick experts in the field to go up against computer programs. He seems to think the computer programs are generally going to do better. And he claims that Mr. Ayer is guilty of selective choices, but I think Moldbug is himself guilty of selective choices. Now, I know this is kind of cheating. I'm speeding up 8-9 years to 2016. But we all remember how everybody crapped the bed predicting the 2016 election with Donald Trump. So what exactly do these models mean? You know, see what here's the developing problem that we see even in 2007. There's a certain, okay, back to my video where I talked about the modem society and the idea that you can, you know, put your foot on the gas pedal and the car goes faster in a relatively predictable fashion, but technique becomes so complicated that it's not entirely clear what causes what. We were in the late 2000s reaching that point. Any maliciousness aside, which only for the sake of argument am I saying, it's not entirely clear that this is a model that is stable. The system that we're operating in is a stable system that is predictable. And so the models that are used to make predictions are based off of what the modelers expect to be the norms, not what actually are. And you saw this very well with 2016 and Donald Trump. And so when it comes to making predictions, as far as long-term predictions, using, you know, the precision of the prediction depends on how closely you follow the events and how much you know about the field itself under which the events are going. But if anybody's been following my channel since its inception in 2015, you'll know that I've made a series of predictions about world events that have happened more or less as I said they would. And that's because I have a single assumption when dealing with modern geopolitics. The future is a lot like the past. Rocket ships and airplanes and tanks don't fundamentally change geography and human nature. And so far, that's true. So there's that. Let's see what we got for the next one. A general theory of corruption mentions Moldbug, September the 5th, 2007. Corruption is any human action that is not what it appears to be. You fold a Benjamin in your passport and hand it to the Ruritanian denier. To anyone behind the yellow line, the denier is ensuring that your presence will not endanger the peaceful citizens of Ruritania. The two of you, the denier is imposing a Ruritanian entry tax, and only the denier knows he has to kick back half that tax to his boss and another third to the shop steward. The government of Ruritania builds a space shuttle so that it can build a space station. It builds the space station, then maintains the shuttle so that it can maintain the space station. Even better, the station is an emergency destination in case there are mechanical problems with the shuttle, and the shuttle can evacuate astronauts in case of an accident on the station. Even better, the intricate and incredibly expensive customs components that comprise these systems are produced by a large industry spread across every province in Ruritania, but especially concentrated in the elaborately important provinces of Mexas, California, and Florubia. The Ruritanian people come together and act as one, decide that all Ruritanians will in the future be philosophers. To this end, it drafts all Ruritanian philosophers into the Ruritanian Peace Force, which will organize and undertake this glorious task. The philosophers, of course, are reluctant because all they want to do is sit around in togas and conduct symposia in their leafy academic groves. However, they are Ruritanian patriots, and they reluctantly accept the temporary commissions as colonels in the RPF, whose commitment to peace is legendary. Each colonel is assigned to a military district where he works closely with the Laputanian Assistance Mission. The Ruritanian people are deeply thankful to the citizens of Laputania for their unflagging commitment to stamping out the gangs of bandits and terrorists behind the occasional disorders in a few isolated backward areas of Ruritania where no one would ever want to go anyway. A peaceful solution to the terrorist problem, of course, can only be obtained through education. To this end, the philosopher colonels are empowered by the Ruritanian people to employ all resources at their command in the glorious task of educating every young Ruritanian as a philosopher, and so on. You get the point. What we see that there are lots of kinds of corruption, but they still have one thing in common: deception. Actually, I prefer that glorious Soviet word, disinformation. Since there is no corruption without disinformation, any theory of corruption is a theory of disinformation. Disinformation is Burnham's formal meaning. The detour is checking your passport. The space shuttle is maintaining the space station. The Ruritanian tots are learning Plato, sure. What any theory of corruption has to explain is how disinformation can succeed in the real world. How does disinformation outcompete information? For any item of disinformation, there is an item of true information which contradicts it. Since few people want to admit to themselves that they believe, or still worse, repeat a lie, one would expect disinformation to have a hard time surviving, much less propagating itself. I don't think corruption can exist without the following two factors. One, the real or informal action generates some relative advantage are compared to the formal action that it pretends to be to one or more of the parties involved. Two, an open recognition of the informal action would generate some relative disadvantage as compared to the maintenance of the formal pretense to one or more of the parties involved. So, okay. I think, so he's saying here that corruption can't exist without, one, the action generating some relative advantages compared to the, so an informal action rather, real or informal, generating some advantage as compared to the formal action that it pretends to be. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. You see, okay, but here, if he's going to talk about disinformation, there are other factors that you could conceivably have. I mean, it might just be the case that the person wants to do in someone he's talking to. He's telling somebody he's talking to intentionally dishonest information in order to bring him down. I guess you could say that Moldbug could say, well, it's generating an advantage for him. I mean, maybe, but maybe he just wants to get revenge. And he's, it may actually cost him to get revenge, but he wants to do it anyhow. So I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Two, an open recognition of the informal action would generate some relative disadvantage as compared to the maintenance of the formal pretense to one or more of the other parties involved. I mean, again, I don't think it's... Well, okay, he says can exist without. I'm doubtful of that. I'm doubtful of that. Consider the case of Ruritania and Donier. If the entry tax is acknowledged and formalized, the receipt from this tax will inevitably disappear into the treasury of Ruritania, from which it will be stolen by someone else entirely. The detour, his boss, and the shop steward will receive no payment at all. Worse, the nosy foreign advisors who are constantly bedeviling the patriotic civil servants of Ruritania will wonder why it employs this weird tax, which probably incurs a high laugher overhead due to its discouragement of tourism and commerce. I mean, another reason why corruption exists is you're just cheap. So Lee Kuan Yew, a name that you should all be familiar with now because I've been dropping it all over the place, in his autobiographical account of the rise of Singapore, mentions that in order to eliminate graft from Singapore, he wanted to have his state employees compensated at the market rate that they would have gotten compensated at working for some Fortune 5 or 400 company. And he's contrasting that with the rest of Asia. And in part, it's because they're just cheap. They don't want to pay people. I mean, rather than some sort of, the person at the top who's squeezing these middle managers in order to not pay them what they're worth, whether they are what he thinks they're worth or not, is just, being cheap or lazy. Or even, with information, right? We have high X information problems. So maybe he just doesn't have enough information and he thinks... See, this is the problem. Moldbug is still thinking, this was quite common in the aughts, you could have something like certain information about a complex system operating. But as we've seen over the last 13 years or more, it's just not the case. It's not the case that you can have that kind of knowledge. And so all sorts of mistakes can be made without necessarily malevolent intentions. Though, of course, many mistakes are made through malevolent intentions. I'm not saying that's not the case either. One way to understand the process of corruption is to look at how corruption develops in a self-regulating, valuable Elamasonarni institution managed on the rotary system. In other words, in the liberal democratic state. The general form of disinformation is the general form of disinformation in a corrupt democracy is the presupposition that the state exists only to serve its citizens. As the public choice economists describe it in exhaustive detail, and as purged pre-war anti-democrats such as Michaels, Mosca, and Pareto first observed, the democratic state's motivation to fulfill its formal elementary function government for the people, by the people, of the people is weak. And its opportunity to transform itself into an informal, lucrative institution is high. Since its motive is obvious and its propensity is notorious, we should expect the uncorrupted democratic state to be quite the rara avis. Let's look at some of the patterns that democratic corruption can take. The simplest form of corruption is the direct private taxation by government employees. I favor the Spanish word for this practice, la mordida, or the bite. If the bite stays entirely with the biter, we have simple mordidism. Simple mordidism is a characteristic of extremely weak states. If the state is not politically powerful enough to at least generate centripetal revenue flow, it is barely worthy of the name. States which exhibit simple mordidism tend to provide poor customer service. Well, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to point this out, but how is this different than a landlord? The landlord is doing the same thing. He's taking the bite out of you through rent. I mean, he's going to say, well, no, a privatized society would be better. It's exactly the same problem. You're going to have the landlord doing this. It doesn't solve anything. See, this is all an incentive thing, right? What we've seen so far is Moldbug thinks that markets have better incentives than public services. But if anybody's seen my debate with Bob Murphy, that's not true, because markets don't produce defense, except for property owners, private property owners like banks and megacorps. And that doesn't serve our interests. But other than that, and even then, they still need to use the state, like at the Blair Mountain Union battle in the 1920s in West Virginia. They still need to do that. So again, it's just quibbling over pedantics. I mean, it's semantics rather. It's pedantic, and it's arguing over semantics. And it's like, whatever. Yeah, I could just say, any corporation, any landlord that can't really generate revenue by charging rent, isn't a landlord worth the name? I mean, you haven't really changed anything in that paragraph. A more advanced form of corruption and more common one is complex mordidism, as demonstrated by our Ruritanian Donier. The profits of graft flow up in a pyramid, complementing or even replacing the formal tax system. Complex mordidism is more stable and pernicious than simple mordidism. It's an institution in its own right. It's impossible for anyone in the pyramid to avoid the professional necessity of stealing. Nevertheless, it remains a characteristic of weak states because the source of the revenue stream in mordidism is the public. Its disinformation has trouble defending itself from public opinion. When the cop takes tips, pretty much everyone knows it. Mordidism is highly vulnerable to undercover investigation, and a state with an honest, loyal, and unhampered law enforcement and judiciary arm can easily root out and destroy it. I mean, the thing is, this kind of complex mordidism exists all over corporate America. Like, I don't know what Moldbug is smoking. It doesn't change. That's what people used to call the good old boys club, which still kind of exists in some sectors of the economy, or has been restructured to include the new diversity hierarchy pyramid types. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing. It doesn't really change. And so, again, it's just transparently facetious. It's really annoying. When most people, such as my favorite NGO, Transparency International, uses the word corruption, they tend to only mean mordidism. By this standard, corruption is rare in the first world democracies. However, I think my broader definition is more useful because other forms of corruption can be ever more efficient. After all, mordidism is just unstructured, unpredictable taxation. If it was lethal to all productive enterprise, there would be no such thing as Italy. In first world democracies, the primary form of corruption is patronage. In a patronage system, the state creates unnecessary work or venal offices as a way of rewarding its political supporters. Right, because we all know corporations don't produce paper pushers and venal offices as a way of rewarding the right people. I mean, even as of 2007, this was a ludicrous thing to say. I mean, I have nothing to add to this. It's ridiculous. In its mildest form, necessary work may be distributed to employees who are selected for political reasons, but the result is the same inefficiency. Patronage is not a democratic invention. Louis XIV sold venal offices but the democracies have certainly raised the art to an unprecedented level of sophistication. The most primitive form of patronage is retail patronage, in which successful political organizations allocate jobs directly to their supporters. Again, this happens all the time in corporate America. That's why there's a glass ceiling for most of us. And why certainly, while it might have been possible in the 60s to start working in the mailroom and then be CEO of a company, it's not possible now. I mean, you don't think the people that have become CEOs of like Disney or Apple or Google aren't just all boys in the club, or all, woke in the club? Of course they are. Those are the only people. I mean, even Moldbug is from this, Brahmin class, as he likes to tell us. He's in the club, sort of, but then he's not in the club, so whatever. The classic form of retail patronage in the U.S. was the spoils system, which is now mostly extinct, although various forms of it still exist in the murkier depths of the closed shop unions. Pork in modern U.S. politics is also a form of retail patronage. The modern democratic state runs on wholesale patronage, in which the state creates and supports entire industries, as in the case of the Rotating aerospace industry. The advantage of wholesale patronage is that it is compared to other mortadism or retail patronage. It seems extremely hygienic. However, it is also far more scalable than retail patronage. Wholesale patronage can easily corrupt the country's entire economy. For example, when we describe government actions as creating jobs, we are speaking the language of wholesale patronage. The modern omnipotent state can create as many jobs as it wants. It can command businesses to hire an extra worker for every position, whose task will be to stand next to the existing employee. Government actions that increase efficiency actually tend to destroy jobs, which may be why these actions are so rare. The problem with wholesale patronage, and the reason it was perfected only in the 20th century, is that it depends on extremely ambitious levels of mass disinformation. Radio and TV were a critical aspect of its breakout. Persuading Ruritanians that they needed to put a Ruritanian on the moon, an awesomely costly and absurdly pointless endeavor, was as much of a breakthrough in public disinformation as in the aerospace engineering. It was the pinnacle of 150 years of Ruritanian patronage and technology. Now, this is actually an interesting thing for Moldbug to say, right? Because Moldbug, as far as we can tell so far, worships technology. Now, again, going back at least to my debate with Bob Murphy, we see that technological development, because it's high risk and very expensive, doesn't often get funded wholesale directly or solely by the private sector. It has to be funded in part by the state, if not entirely, as we'll say, the Manhattan Project or NASA. And so it's not clear what Moldbug is getting at, because on the one hand, if the government uses technology to create funds technology to create ultimately new jobs, they do destroy the older jobs that come before, but that's something that Moldbug should approve of, because he wants this advancement of technology, the digital tech space. And it's interesting that Moldbug would put technology under misinformation. I mean, hey, look, I'm very tech skeptic. I mean, I agree with the point that a lot of this technology utopianism was disinformation. I just find it interesting that Moldbug is saying this. To me, that's interesting. Now, of course, we've moved on. Clearly, the most advanced form of wholesale patronage in the world today is environmentalism, or what we might call eco-patronage. Raise your hand if you know someone who owes his or her job to the environmental movement. Raise your other hand if you know more than 5 such persons. Eco-patronage is especially excellent because it creates not just jobs, but high-status professional jobs. And lately it has metastasized, creating entire green industries, which seem to have nothing at all to do with the state. If only. Oh, well, now this is interesting. I got a term now for everybody here. We'll call it techno-patronage. Raise your hand if you know anybody that has a job in the tech industry. 5. How many people do you know? Now the question is, why is that the case? Because of the government. Because the government invested in all this. It's all DARPA. All of this is DARPA. All of this is the Cold War. So Moldbug is literally sawing off the branch that he's sitting on. His entire budding tech digital industry was all DARPA. Facebook was LifeLog, which didn't exist yet. Facebook comes on a little bit. Well, maybe it did exist. Let's see. Facebook. When did Facebook exist? 2004. Well, there you go. It did exist. Well, that was lifelong. This is a so like he's just crying, wah wah. Why do the eco people get this gig when he owes his position to just the same kind of graft that he claims the environmentalists owe their position to? It's just ridiculous. Ridiculous. Some stuff in the comments. We got Cyber Ninja Zero. Hello. No one. Mailman to the CEO or propaganda. I believe it. I believe it. Hello, Chunking 666. And then Mutant 12. Nice. All right. Of course, good customer service requires some level of environmental law enforcement. I have no desire to find blobs of mercury floating in my milk. I think it's nice that I can take a boat out on any river in the U.S. and not have to worry that when I light a cigarette, a slick of volatile petrochemicals will ignite and incinerate me in a great gout of flame, and so on. However, I don't think it's too cynical for me to feel that the production of 1,000-page environmental impact statements for new buildings in existing cities has a slight odor of travail artificial. Who knows what these documents say besides pigeons will fly into it, but I suppose they must say something. Wait a minute. I mean, we can say the same thing about Moldbug, technological impact statements. I mean, that's got the odor of travail artificial. I mean, this is all just, something that a deep state psyop from DARPA to LifeLog to Facebook in order to get us in a control grid that they know where we're at 24/7. I mean, that's really a lot more sinister and dark than any of these eco-patronage that Moldbug is complaining about. Therefore, when we argue about the percentage of eco-patronage in modern environmentalism, we have, as the proverb goes, establish the principle and are merely negotiating the price. Yeah, that's the Churchill. It's a funny joke, though not for YouTube. Again, motive, propensity, and opportunities are quite evident. Another form of high-tech modern patronage is edu-patronage, in which the state funds and encourages the strange practice known as education. In the last 60 years, the traditional fields of art and science have been thoroughly assimilated into higher edo-patronage. The quantity of art and science produced by the edo-patronage machine is mind-boggling by any historical standard. Its average quality, of course, is extremely low. While it's hard to speculate on the product of these weird divergent curves, and it's clear that edo-patronage absorbs a large number of very intelligent citizens whose labor could produce many useful goods and services if returned to the productive economy. Well, two things. One, for Moldbug's budding techno economy, in order to lower the cost per unit of trained technician, you have to glut the market, supply and demand. The more of these people you have in the market, the less you can afford to pay them. And the more you can overall hire to make this system work, the very system that Moldbug wants to be created. So it's sort of built into the system for his own techno future. And then as far as, arts and literature going down the drain, that's because of science itself. STEM outspent the liberal arts 1,000 to 1 in higher education because that's where, quote, all the money was. So it's like, dude. Edo-patronage is especially nifty because it kills two birds with one stone. It simultaneously produces patronage jobs and propagates the disinformation that these jobs are essential. Of course, an effective edo-patronage system can produce all kinds of disinformation and thus protect all kinds of corruption. The relationship between edo-patronage and eco-patronage is quite symbiotic, for example. It's also symbiotic with edo-patronage and tech patronage. I mean, where do you think all these technicians come from? It's not quite patronage per se, except in the sense that it creates the professional of suffering for pay, but another form of corruption that's quite common in modern democracies is pseudo-charity. The formal meaning of pseudo-charity is the state is mixing aggregate utility by transferring resources from those who need them less to those who need them more. And it may well be doing exactly this. However, the actual reason for the prevalence of pseudo-charity is that it's a perfect way for the state to buy votes. Pseudo-charity also tends to be delivered in kind rather than in cash, providing abundant opportunity for the patronage proper. Right. Well, there's another kind of pseudo-charity. It's called Rockefeller Libraries. It's called endowments. It's called the non-profit organizations. Now, I think Logos and I might have brought this up when Logos and I were doing the review of the Orrin McIntyre video. But in the 50s, there was an investigation by Norman Dodd of nonprofits, which were all basically charity fronts for the big financial sectors, Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, in order to do, altruistic work, which was really just creating this control grid for them by building libraries. I mean, how many libraries over this country were endowed by Carnegie? Now, what do you think those libraries are going to teach? What do you think they're going to have their main agenda be? Well, at least back in the day, it was what Carnegie wanted them to have. And depending if they still have connections with the Carnegie Foundation, it's what Carnegie wants them to say. So again, I mean, this is just, I think the doth protest too much. It's like, give me a break, Moldbug. Give me a break. It's always easy to distinguish pseudo-charity from actual charity, because pseudo-charity strives to create dependency, whereas charity just strives to avoid it. Well, that's technology. They want, the big financial assets, the Fords, Carnegies, Rockefellers want us dependent upon them, not independent. Pseudo-charity will go almost all the way toward making charity a legal right, but it will not go all the way. Because if a charity rights were true property, the recipients would feel no political obligations to their masters. For example, rights to future Social Security payments could easily be converted to treasury obligations and simply given to the recipients. Rights to free medical care could become diagnosis-triggered payments, which the recipient could spend on either expensive, painful, and ineffective heroic measures or on a last vacation to Tahiti. Either of these transformations would be a Pareto optimizing and eliminate large federal bureaucracies and political constituencies, which is probably why I've never heard anyone even suggest them. If you feel that the tax revenue should be used for charitable purposes, there is a simple way to accomplish this. Scrutinize the tax revenue as a treasury bond and give the bond to the private charity of your choice. Any other approach is probably a form of pseudo-charity, even if that is not the intent. It's almost never the intent. Because remember, boys and girls, the Brahmins are very nice, good people that never do anything bad. And, of course, Moldbug is a Brahmin, so he ought to know. I'm sure there's no dark conspiracies. Oh, I forgot. It's just, adaptive behavior. Right, Moldbug. Everything that's happened in the last 16 years is just adaptive behavior. What do you know? Of course, one invariant in democratic disinformation is the proposition that the rotary system is an infallible prophylactic, or at least the best available prophylactic against corruption. As we've seen, to describe this proposition as implausible is to describe the Pope as Catholic. All of today's democratic governments originated as minimalist, elementary states whose only formal purpose was to protect the citizens and enforce the law. All are now unapologetic tax maximizers, most of whose activities can be described as patronage and pseudo-charity. Again, Moldbug, why do the governments grow? Well, because, at least in the United States, all these private actors called corporations started taking over, and there was no one really to challenge them. Of course, they then started buying out the government, and they developed a symbiotic relationship, and now we're here. Before I move on, one thing that really needs to be clear here is that the overall arc of the rise and fall of the United States is the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, many libertarians would agree with me on this. Now, who killed the bank? Who killed the bank? Andrew Jackson, 1837. Mr. Populist, Mr. Every free male in the country gets a vote. So we literally have an American populist, because remember, populism doesn't work, guys, unless you kill the bank. So Andrew Jackson was a populist who used the power of the people to destroy the bank. I mean, okay, that's the one element that we can actually all agree here is the problem. And that's how it was beaten. In fact, it was the only time it was beaten. Well, there you go. And that explains why in 2011, they got hot under the collar and wanted to break up the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, because it looked like that could happen again. So just for the record, American democracy beat the bank until after the Civil War, even way up, all the way up into the early 20th century, in which case, through rather subtle means, they came back. And ultimately, they came back in secret. I think that's ultimately how they subverted the Jacksonian system. The Jacksonian system works, and nothing Moldbug proposes is anywhere close to that or close to working. Let's see. Why is this not... Wait. Yeah, I did that. Okay. Why is this not surprising? It's not surprising because the idea of limited government is inherently implausible. Note the suspicious passive voice in limited. Who does the limiting? Government is sovereign by definition. Who can force it to limit itself? The Pope? How many divisions does the Pope have? During the Second Republic period, 1789-1861, the U.S. federal government remained quite small. Though some of its military and financial ventures were non-trivial, this may be partly explained by its legal formula of limited government. But the Supreme Court under John Marshall discarded the theory of enumerated powers quite early. Probably a more parsimonious explanation is the structure of political factions in this period, which opposed aristocratic centralists against populist decentralists, the latter being generally triumphant. The invention of a populist centralism toward the end of the Second Republic, culminating in Lincolnian unionism, terminated small government in America. Anyone who thinks he can uninvent this idea, or any idea for that matter, is smarter than me. In general, I think the error of the libertarian minarchist is to believe that making the state weaker is an effective way to make it smaller, since most of these activities of the informalized pseudo-elementary state constitute corruption, and since it's actually harder for a weak state to control corruption, this means the mean is inappropriate to the end. All right, so this is where Moldbug is arguing for a centralized state because it can more effectively root out corruption. But you see, here's a catch-22 here, right? So let's look at another example. I remember reading a book 10, 15 years ago about the Pinkertons. And they were pioneering sort of scientific forensics in order to catch people. And they were modeling themselves after the French, who had, a well-funded, supported state police force. The problem, led by a man named Vidocq, but the problem was, of course, the French monarchy was tyrannical and could arrest you and throw you in prison without proper due process. Now, the U.S. federal government didn't have that power until the FBI, which was then modeled after the Pinkertons. But that's the trade-off. I mean, do you want some thieves to go unpunished, or do you want the government to be able to throw you in jail without a trial? I mean, again, Thomas Sowell says there's no solutions, only trade-offs. I kind of wish libertarians and, these free market fanatics would realize that. They'll say that when they're arguing with a socialist or a statist, but then not when they're giving you their own, utopian fantasies. So I don't know what to say about that. Okay, let's see. Similarly, the state that does not maximize tax revenue provides in the revenue it foregoes for elementary reasons a juicy target for political factions who would redirect that revenue to patronage or pseudo-charity. Foregone revenue can be redirected as revenue distribution to those who benefit from low taxes, and the racket pattern of tax increases across democratic history testifies to the comparative strength of corruption as opposed to elementary rectitude as a principle of political organization. Perhaps the nastiest bit of democratic disinformation is the association of democracy with social harmony. In fact, the conflict between political factions is a form of ritualized warfare any way you slice it, and it doesn't take much to degenerate into actual combat. The American founders actually thought they had designed a factionless semi-democratic republic, I'm sure. The real miracle of American democracy is that it produced only one major civil war. My conclusion, which is why I'm called a neo-cameralist, is that the sovereign elementary institution is the political equivalent of the perpetual motion machine. The real choice is not between the elementary state and the lucrative state, but between the informal lucrative state and the formal lucrative state. In the formal lucrative state, by definition, we see no systematic mortadism, patronage, or pseudo-charity. I mean, that's literally the stupidest thing I ever heard. Let's look at the history of the monarchy of England, especially after the Mormons. It's formal. It's a lucrative state. It's we all know who's in charge. It's the king. And there's all sorts of kickbacks and funny money and expropriating from the Saxon peasants and all sorts of this crap, which leads to circular firing squad civil war, Stephen and Matilda's anarchy, and culminating in the death of the entire Plantagenet line in the War of the Roses. I mean, one civil war versus like unending civil disruption in medieval England. I mean, this is just, it's a joke. It's just a joke. The formal lucrative state is managed by and for its shareholders. Any sort of corruption comes straight out of their pockets, and they have no reason to tolerate it. Well, so I guess according to Moldbug, the East India Company didn't have any corruption. Give me a break. That's so childishly delusional. I got nothing to say to that. Chat. Interesting. Let's see here. What I haven't explained, however, is whether the formal lucrative state is any better than the unfortunate democratic competitor or maintaining this formalism. The fact that mortadism, patronage, and pseudo-charity are very rare in private corporations does not demonstrate that the phenomena will be equally rare in sovereign corporations. They are also rare in private elementary institutions, and for the same reason, because they are prohibited by law and the law is enforced by the chartering sovereign. The essential question is whether a sovereign lucrative institution, an animal which has never existed in history, although some approximations have been approached, can remain formal. As we've seen, reason indicates that a sovereign elementary institution can regulate itself and prevent corruption, and history gives us no cause to doubt this conclusion. As we've seen, reason indicates that a sovereign elementary institution cannot regulate itself and prevent corruption, and history gives us no case to doubt this conclusion. Next week, we'll try to find out whether shareholders can maintain a control of a sovereign corporation or whether it is likely to suffer the same fate of being seized informally by its management. Spoiler alert, it can't. The East India Company went to crap in 1857 with the Sepoy Rebellion, and the informal British government took over. So no, history shows us that it's not going to work. All right. Moldbug. What do we got? What's the next one? Mediocracy, definition, etiology, and treatment. Mentions Moldbug, September the 8th, 2007. Fabian Tisano has coined the interesting noun mediocrity, which he gives two meanings: the rule of the mediocre, two, the triumph of style over substance. His book of the same name, which for some reason is almost impossible to get in the US, and I'm grateful to the author for sending me a review copy, is a comprehensive and witty dictionary of British mediocrity, specifically in its New Labour flavor. If you've ever been east of Nantucket or you've read Peter Hitchens' Abolition of Britain, you may be aware that the old country has experienced something of a political transition in the last 50 years. One specific feature of the new British regime is a vicious hatred of excellence and exclusiveness, perhaps best typified by the egregious educrat Tony Crossland, who once said, "If it's the last thing I do, I'm going to destroy every grammar school in England." Since history is always fascinated by destroyers, I wouldn't be surprised if Tisano's label has some legs. Of course, we have mediocrity on our side of the pond as well, though the blend is slightly different. Americans call political correctness a cumbersome phrase with no redeeming qualities. The British Fabian Association may be slightly off, but surely mediocrity is better than PCism, with its paucity of declensions and its odd Trotskyist overtones. Besides, dissident terminology needs to be refreshed regularly as society comes to associate it with the figures whom the authorities present as typical dissidents. Such hooligans are invariably unhip, so in their terms become unhip, and so does anyone who uses them. And it's the task of all the dissidents, left or right or wrong, to be cooler than the state. Okay, I'll wait. In any case, I suppose to be reviewing the book, not the word. And I recommend both. Each page of Mediocrity is its own soundbite, with its own Orwellian ort of mediocritas, defined by the author and illustrated with a quote of two from some ennobled mediocratic ass. The effect is half Devil's Dictionary, half Diversity Workshop, half Lingua Torredi Imperii. Suitably repackaged and miniaturized, I feel it could be quite a hit on the Harry Frankfurt cash register market. If you need a preview, Tisano's blog has exactly the same format. Tisano's thesis is that the modern English language is contaminated with inversions and deceptions, aka built-in lies. In UR's doxology of corruption, we call this wholesale disinformation. Of course, Mr. Blair also has some thoughts on the matter. A good example is the mediocratic definition of the word radical. Fasano's old definition is implying a break with prevailing intellectual and moral customs. His new or inverted definition is criticizing bourgeois concepts such as individuality or privacy. He comments, Mediocracy, like 1984's Oceania, requires its audience to believe in a continual need for ideological battle. Although this war has been won and everyone has absorbed the required beliefs and fight against the former enemy, capitalism, Christianity, conservatism, etc., can never cease. Any sign of resistance must be treated as proof that the enemies of mediocrity are still powerful. Under mediocrity, the discoveries of modernism, reflexivity, secularism, loss of the self, social construction, etc., have been fully assimilated. Yet mediocratic culture continues to assault the straw man of traditionalism, who can somehow never be quite dead enough. It is important that the critique of the non-meritocratic continues to carry the radical label, however much critique has become dogma. Now, this is very true and not unenlightening. Perhaps there's a slightly percussive quality to 168 straight pages of it, but anyone who's not a Landwehr veteran has spent his or her entire education life in a mediocracy, and there's no re-education without repetition. Couple points here. One, this is equally true of the American right. This sort of like, I mean, and I used to believe this for a while too. So it's, especially in 2007. But this idea that there's like some sort of like far left, socialist, abolish all private property, secret cabal in America that's going to like rise up and like expropriate Walmart and, Google. It's ridiculous. It doesn't exist. The left that does exist, and in fact, that existed then, was just a synthetic left that was in favor of all the alphabet soup and, oppression Olympics, which were completely compatible with corporations because it served the purpose of eliminating white men from middle management. So it cuts both ways. So really, I'm not saying that Fasano's wrong in his broader theory, but the right has this version of it too. And the reason why the right and the left both have this reflexive fear of historical boogeymans, even though the particular iteration of the boogeyman they're afraid of is gone, is because the machine itself and the simulation that it casts as it moves us into the future is afraid of that boogeyman and has to continually create the impression that it's there in order to move itself forward into the future. So I don't see that that's really like a left-wing thing per se. I see this a lot on the right. It's really the fact that the past is, brutish, nasty, and short, as Hobbes said. And we're so enlightened now, we can't imagine going back. However, while reading Mediocracy, I realized that I had a simple editing suggestion, which perhaps could be applied to a new US edition. It might be expressed as a simple VI command. This should be applied to the covers, front matter, and alt text. I feel it would spice things up a little and make for better talk show coverage. So, for example, the above would read, Democracy, like 1984's Oceania, requires its audience to believe in a continual need for ideological battle. Although the war has been won and everyone has been absorbed, the required beliefs, the fight against the former enemy, capitalism, Christianity, conservatism, can never cease. Wait, how can the war against capitalism have been won when, like, literally all of these megacorps run America? I mean, it's just so tone deaf. I guess he's, in Oceania in 1984, that was what that regime said, but there's supposed to be an implied equivalency here. Any resistance must be treated as proof that the enemies of democracy are still powerful. As if corporations in 2000, dude, the banks and the corporations bailed themselves out with the government money. Of course they're still powerful. It's unbelievable. Under democracy, the discoveries of modernism, reflexivity, secularism, loss of the self, social construction, etc., have been fully assimilated. Yet democratic culture continues to assault the straw man of traditionalism, who can still somehow never be quite dead enough. It is important that the critique of the non-democratic continues to carry the radical label, however much such critique has become dogma. Because what does mediocrity call itself? What do the mediocrats call themselves? Why not take them at face value? If you are criticizing some philosophical system, religious doctrine, alien sci-fi cult doxology, etc., Why not do it the courtesy of using the name it uses for itself? This edition is congenial to almost all of Tosano's definitions, even if democracy itself. The theory of democracy is that everyone's view is given equal weight. Whoa. I mean, maybe in the modern sense of the word, democracy, but even then, I'm not so sure. Because clearly, in its original inception in ancient Athens, everybody wasn't given a view. And even those that had views weren't all equally held. Now, there's true with the modern left, there is this sort of mote and Bailey where they'll say on the one hand, democracy is just being engaged in politics of the workplace, having an active decision-making role. That's one thing they'll say. But then there is this streak of egalitarianism and equality, and they'll mote and Bailey between the two. So it is fair enough confusing when they use the word. And that's in all likelihood what Moldbug is criticizing here, the left, when he says democracy. But, many like, in light of his Hobbits article, a lot of Hobbits will use the word democracy, and they certainly don't mean it the way the left that Moldbug is criticizing does. In practice, if no genuine alternatives are offered, the weight of each voter's view is zero. In a democracy, the political elite proceeds largely as it wishes, with the electorate's contribution limited to derision. Some organizations in a democracy may have sufficient financial power to put the case for mildly dissenting viewpoints, which not surprisingly tend to be biased towards a particular group of constituents, e.g. smokers. Making things more democratic comes to mean eliminating the influence of such organizations, thus eliminating the only significant source of real diversity. Can you tell what this passage should have? But can you tell what this passage said before the search and replace? And does it matter? No, I'm pretty sure Tosano does not agree with this. I get the impression he thinks, what most people think, that mediocrity is a corruption of democracy, not the real thing. Just a kind of voodoo zombie imposter which has hijacked the good name of true democracy. I mean, another thing to say here. I mean, this is awfully rich, right? I mean, mediocrity is rampant in bureaucracies and rampant in corporate America. Like, I don't know who he's kidding. I mean, these are some of the most unimaginative, narrow-minded, bean-counting people out there. Good luck having a sophisticated conversation about the Nicomachean ethics with a Wall Street executive. Yeah, good luck with that. However, let's look at what we know. What we know is that all democracies in the world are mediocracies. We know that past democracies contain non-mediocratic elements. We also know that they contain aristocratic elements, as today's mediocrats consider non-democratic. And we know that in mediocrity's cousin, Russian cousin, People's Democracy, many people who criticize the regime phrase their criticisms as ways to restore socialism, to make it truer to its own socialist ideals, which turn out to be rather beside the point. It strikes me that the simplest interpretation of these facts is that democracy is a degenerative political condition, a pure and unmitigated evil. This doesn't mean that there are not worse systems of government than democracy, nor does it mean that all the entirely unrelated features of healthy societies that have somehow become associated with the management selection algorithms such as freedom and law and iPods are bad. All it means is that if the Duke of Wellington were still in charge, Britain might be a much more pleasant place today. Certainly, its criminal rate would not have risen by a factor of 47 during the 20th century. That's not 47%, folks. That's 4,700%. I also suspect that might still have its empires, industries, etc. Of course, today's Britons are well trained to believe that all these changes were for the better, or at least inevitable. But I suspect the Englishmen of 1907 would have begged to differ. Well, I mean, this is kind of a strange thing for Moldbug to say, because England was always the most, in his mind, democratic of European countries, because they had parliament going back to like 1250. And so, they had elections, they had parliament. The king was more of a figure after 1688. So it's more like he just doesn't like it that these kinds of people are in charge rather than the kinds of people that he wants, the technocrats, which are in charge now. So it's like we've got what Moldbug wanted, and it's even worse. All of these eggheads, who ran, the first, Apple computers are now running everything, and it's a mess. And there's a whole other reason for that's a mess, but what is mediocrity anyway? I think an accurate definition is coherent democracy, that is, democratic political system which has succeeded in fully coordinating its public opinion, generally through a cradle-to-grave information system, in which the perspectives of official and quasi-official educators and journalists become synchronized. Since educators and journalists educate and inform the next generation of educators and journalists, it's not too hard to see how this might work. It's the political equivalent of a laser. A small amount of political divergence survives in today's mediocrities, but it's negligible by historical standards. See, okay, this is why Moldbug's fetishization and focus on the social science wing of education is flawed, because what we had, even in the 80s and 90s, in America, something like a robust history department in many universities, something like a robust philosophy department. All of that's been gutted in favor of what? Tech. It's been, they outspent STEM, social sciences 1,000 to 1. Now, who ousted them? Well, it was the market system. These guys that were doing history and philosophy, well, that's just not going to pay the bills. That's not going to get the patronage money coming in from the big corporations who want to build labs and experimental systems so that we can get money for our school. So we're just going to, defund these, cancel these, and then send in the engineers and the computer programmers. So in this regard, forces outside of the academy dictated who got to inform the next generation. And it wasn't the one that came before. Well, not within the STEM, the social science departments. They were gutted, and they were determined by people on the outside. Now, it is true that the far left also infiltrated and gutted these departments by reducing them to inane trivialities. That's true too. But ultimately, the money just went elsewhere. And that's the problem. Specifically, the mediocrity we have today is best characterized as a non-theistic theocracy. That's an oxymoron, but okay, Moldbug. It's an official tradition as a modern descendant of Calvinist Protestantism I called universalism. The cultural answers of the universalists have been called progressives, Fabians, Unitarians, evangelicals, nonconformists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Charterists, Methodists, Dissenters, Puritans, Roundheads. Okay, it's a word salad. Like, that doesn't mean anything. For example, Puritans, tarred and feathered Quakers. Stupid. Any good Anglican from any day between 1660 and 1960 would have identified the current Archbishop of Canterbury as a hardcore dissenter or low church man, and they would certainly accept this as a final and conclusive evidence that the conquest of Britain by Massachusetts is complete. Well, if we're going to look at, the most base part of England, most base part of the British Isles, it's Northern Ireland, which is where all the hardcore, Congregationalists are, and Presbyterians. This is a joke. Catholic Ireland is a joke. Scotland's a joke. England proper is a joke. It's basically the most hardcore descendants of the Puritans in Northern Ireland that are the most based in all the British Isles. Again, Moldbug is just spouting out word salad. Doesn't have anything to do with anything. The actual source of communism is Renaissance Catholic thinkers. You have Thomas More's Utopia. Now, the Marxists themselves point to More. You have Karl Kautsky, who writes A History of Socialism, and he considers Thomas More the first modern socialist, along with Thomas Müntzer. And then you have Lenin building him a statue in Moscow in 1918. They're not building a statue to Oliver Cromwell or Cotton Mather. They're building a statue to Thomas More. They're praising Thomas More. We know this. It's a joke. And then, of course, is the other element that Moldbug wishes to obscure. If this theory is correct, universalism is a legitimate modern heir of an old and very respectable stream of thought, which has produced an enormous amount of cultural value. So perhaps the problem is simply that while evangelicals and their doctrines are a healthy ingredient in a healthy society, it's bad news when they achieve total dominance. So as a critic of mediocrity, it's very natural to think that the obvious solution is uncoordinated democracy. That is, democracy in which there are actually meaningful, substantive decisions and fluctuations in popular political opinion, and in which such fluctuations expressed electorally can actually result in actual significant changes in government personnel and procedures. Yeah, Moldbug. You mean like killing the Fed, killing the bank, which is exactly what Jackson did using those systems? What do you know? The actual problem that the libertarians like Moldbug and someone like myself can agree on. Well, it worked in 1837. I think we need to figure out how and why it worked. There are two problems with this solution. One is extremely obvious. People have been trying it more or less continuously for the last 50 years, and mediocrity continues its advance. Perhaps this is because wishing the public opinion where X, whereas it's actually Y, does not constitute a procedure for converting Y into X, even if X is right and Y is wrong. Furthermore, mediocrity is very good at defying public opinion. For example, on immigration, it can do this because it knows the time is on its side. Public opinion in a mediocrity always converges on official opinion. Sometimes this process is slow, but I know of no exceptions. Two, it assumes without any evidence or reasoning, thinking at all, that democracy is a good thing. Of course, everyone believes democracy is a good thing, but this is a good reason for believing anything. I believe Professor Dawkins has a few thoughts on the subject. If you accept the theory that public opinion is always wise opinion, you are forced to accept not only democracy, but also mediocrity. If you don't, how can you believe in democracy? Democracy as a modern political system is always associated with universalism, and its ancestors and unbelievers in universalism have tended to express their distaste for it in terms both pungent and prescient. This does not make democracy wrong, but it doesn't make it right neither. The term I prefer for uncourted democracy is oclarchy, that is mob rule. If you think real democracy is a good thing, you might want to think through its history a little bit, making some effort to distinguish between reality and lipstick. You mean like defeating the bank? But I'm sorry. I guess Moldbug likes the Fed after all. Ochlocratic elections, for example, are almost always associated with paramilitary violence. What? Right, guys. Remember the history books where Athens was like racked by constant paramilitary violence? Or like Switzerland, where people are just running around shanking each other after the election? I don't remember that either. Funny how that works. Most people know that the U.S. Civil War was a breakdown of electoral conflict and dual rule proper. How many of us have heard of the Republican military arm, the Wide Awakes? In fact, mob violence was a ubiquitous feature of American democracy from its birth to the New Deal when it became mediocratic. Mediocrity is a problem, no doubt, but it's not the worst thing in the world. One of the main problems with mediocrity is that it depends on centralized control of public information, a control which is rapidly evaporating. Wow. Be careful what you write, kids, because 16 years later, you might look the fool for writing it. Such as homeschooling, blogger, YouTube, etc. Military-grade hatred is not at all hard to find in today's mediocrities. It's only confined to marginal fringe by the inertial remnants of the old-line journalism, which are rapidly evaporating. And the official universities, which were at once at least bastions of moderation, have evolved for very sensible adaptive reasons into universalist madrasas at best, and petri dishes of Chomsky political hydrophobia at worst. Oh, of course. Remember. Adaptive reasons. Right. Sure. Not subversion, not a conspiracy, just adaptive. Don't worry, guys. It's adaptive. Oh, boy. Ergo, I conclude mediocrity is an extremely dangerous condition in need of urgent treatment. If it survives in its present state, the future holds nothing but Brezhnevist sclerosis, possibly with newer and better iPods. If nothing else, its financial system is quite unsustainable. If mediocrity collapses and we see a new birth of internet-powered oclarchy, Chomskyites will be fighting white nationalists in the streets, and the latter, being better armed and well-trained, will almost certainly prevail. Do you want this? I'll bet some UR readers want this. I don't. Well, he is right about the the WNs winning street fights. They're really good at that. But the Brezhnevist sclerosis has set in upon America under Moldbug's class, the tech class, who centralized information and restored public control. Like, I know this was all the rage back in the day, but I can't believe people were so delusional. depends on centralized control of public information, a control which is rapidly evaporating. People can literally make up stuff about Ukraine, like what happened on Snake Island last year, and they'll believe it. Now we're having like deep fakes. I mean, man, this is, I don't know how anybody could have seriously entertained this. It's delusional. So what is the treatment? I find that people who grew up believing in democracy have a strong urge to separate solutions into two categories, democratic and non-democratic. Of course, there is nothing wrong with the democratic election in which the people express their realization that they have been duped, suckered, and taken for a 200-year ride, but that ride is over. Finito, done. But if you agree with me that democracy is the problem, not the solution, there's nothing wrong with a military coup in which the military expresses the same realization. I find it ironic, right, that in the previous paragraph, Moldbug points out the absurdity of street fights between white nationalists and Chomskyites and how that ought to be avoided. And then immediately jumps into the absurdity of a military coup and accepts that as completely fine. Okay, dude. Like, whatever your sliding scale of standards is, I'd like to know what they are. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of democracy is that the mob power became identified with political power at exactly the last point in history at which mobs were militarily relevant. In the age of the machine gun, the military is at all times sovereign, whether it likes it or not. As long as it acts in a unified and disciplined way, it can do whatever it wants, as the experience of China shows. It is by no means always a mistake to fire into a mob. If the sovereigns of the concert of Europe had realized the technology was on their side, the murderous degringolade of the 20th century might never have happened. Of course, Moldbug is being retarded because World War I was started by these countries from the concert of Europe, which I think at the time was Germany, or Prussia, Russia, Austria, and I think at that time included England as well. But then England left. So they started World War I. Those three countries. I don't know what history book Moldbug is reading. World War I started in Serbia when Austria mobilized to fight Serbia, Russia mobilized to fight Austria, and then Germany mobilized to fight Russia. It was the concert of European powers that started World War I and this whole 20th century hemoclism. Again, moving on. However, neither democratic nor non-democratic means can terminate mediocrity without a clear and effective program for the new regime. The method matters less than the endpoint. As a maximalist program, of course, I recommend full neocameralism. However, there are many ways to manage a state that involve neither neocameralism nor democracy, Singapore and Dubai being excellent examples. The most important realization is the fact, elegantly demonstrated by proto-neocameralist city-states, such as Singapore, Hong Kong, and Dubai, that politics is not necessary to a free, stable, and productive modern society. This proposition has not been demonstrated above the urban level, which is one reason that a new regime should move aggressively to decentralize, dissolving national and transnational political bodies in favor of independent cities or regions. This is a kind of strange self-exemption. He's like, well, neocameralism doesn't work on a large scale, but it might work on a small scale. Well, that was sort of always the argument that the classical proponents of democracy made, that it would work on a small scale, but not on a large scale. So it's like, wait a minute, Moldbug. Wait a minute. This is apples to oranges now. Eliminating politics is not a trivial operation. The goal of politics is power, and for a fairly long transitional period after the abolition of democracy, large numbers of people will continue to harbor the hope that they can achieve power by focusing and controlling public opinion in the old mediocratic style. While preventing this is ultimately the task of the security forces, there is no need to make their job any harder than it needs to be. Well, the obvious question to ask Moldbug here is this already failed. Russia tried to do this under the Tsars, and other, the French monarchy and the Bourbons tried this. It doesn't work. The popular groundswell of angry revolutionaries overthrows everything. Like, whoa, what is he going to do differently than those people? And so, yeah, I don't see it. Therefore, the sine qua non of any regime change whose goal is to defeat mediocrity is to completely defeat and liquidate of the old mediocratic power structure. There is absolutely no need to restrict freedom of speech or any other personal freedom. The problem is entirely organizational. Just establishment of the universalist information organs is sufficient. Mediocracy can be defeated. Wait a minute, though. Wait a minute. Moldbug just said you couldn't have control of information. So, I mean, we know he's wrong because it was restored through the techno-oligarchs. But if you have free flow of information, why can't you just have this like unending, perpetual universalist threat? Which, if that's the case, he falls into his own self-parody of, oh, we beat universalism, but it's never really gone, guys. So I don't see how he doesn't just self-parody once he wins. You know, for a wannabe elf, he sounds pretty much like a hobbit. I mean, I don't know what this guy's deal is. Is he an elf that got demoted to a hobbit? Mediocrity can be defeated by one principle of good government, separation of information and state. The state must care what its citizens do. It has no good reason to give a rat's ass about what they think. This principle implies a number of specific rules. Oh, well, unless what they think threatens the identity of the state itself, like dangerous revolutionary thoughts. But, you know, this principle implies a number of specific rules to the separation of church and state, separation of education and state, separation of science and state, separation of art and state, etc. If we apply the same strict security presently given in the U.S. to the first of these, we end up with a system in which the state is entirely out of the business of managing public opinion, thus breaking the feedback loop of mediocrity. You know, Moldbug earlier said, can we imagine a formal democracy in which, the information is communicated faithfully from the voters to the government? And he says, we can't imagine that. That's a pipe dream. How is the separation of X from the state not a pipe dream? Looking at all these things, when has all of this ever held at any point in history? It hasn't. So if you're going to argue that you can't have a real democracy because it's never been in history, well, then this has never been in history. So what is a Moldbug? Furthermore, in a regime change, the only goal of the new regime is stability and success. The new regime is establishing a law in a lawless state in which laws disintegrate into a morass of ritual and procedure. If it was concerned with following the rituals and procedures of the old regime, it would not be a new regime. Therefore, it is justified in seizing and either dissolving or privatizing according to its best judgments all subsidized or officially supported information organs of the old mediocrity, including universities, newspapers, TV, and radio stations, schools, etc. Probably the first option is the safest. Most of the real estate of the top mediocratic universities is essentially located and quite valuable. Redevelopment options will not be hard to find. In a post-mediocratic state, education is a purely parental responsibility. Young people will learn whatever their parents choose to teach them or have taught them or expose them to. Official involvement in the process, even in the form of subsidies, is unthinkable. Likewise, journalism is a purely private function. When the state discloses information, it does so under the equivalent of the Reg FD, releasing all information to all bloggers at the same time. There are no press conferences, leaks, unofficial sources, off-the-record conversations, etc., etc. Modern government has no need for even quasi-official information organs. As for the broadcast spectrum, it should be turned off and resold for peer-to-peer networking. Of course, perhaps there are other ways to defeat mediocrity. If anyone has suggested, I'd be curious to hear them. Well, that's all well and good, Moldbug. Would any of these things be out of the hands of private corporations? We don't want the East India Company, after all. Man, oh man, let's see. What a mess. What a mess. Okay. The real meaning of diversity. Mentions Moldbug, September the 9th, 2007. The last post may have struck some readers as over the top. The last post. I think almost all Moldbug's posts struck me as over the top. But this one will be even more fun. However, there are some prerequisites to anti-corruption. See, guys, this is why we're reading it all the way through, because he makes reference to his earlier essays. And we've been through those, if you followed the journey this whole time. One hypothesis of UR is that the wholesale disinformation is rife in modern Western society. This hypothesis is not the sort that gets confirmed or refuted with statistics and p-values. It's a rhetorical perspective, not a data set. It makes no pretense of mathematical ineluctability. It is certainly not science. Nevertheless, I like the word hypothesis because it expresses sort of humility before reality, a Socratic sense of starting from scratch. Starting from scratch, then, diversity. Let's borrow Lev Navrazov's trick of italicizing the questionable words. We don't know, again, if there is anything corrupt about the word diversity, but surely we are permitted to question it. And of course, by corrupt, he means disinformation. And I'm sure he's going to tell us how. There's a fun experiment in diversity that you can try in your own home. All you need is a blender, a spoon, and about $30. Take the $30, go to Safeway and buy a 4 or 5 pint of ice cream, preferably ultra premium. Ben & Jerry's works well for all different flavors: chocolate, strawberry, cherry, Garcia, Funky Monkey, and so on. Use the spoon some ice cream from each one of the pints into the blender until it's about half full. When you're done, lick the spoon and make sure it's not in the blender. This will make a very loud noise and may void your warranty. Observe the blender carefully. Are its contents diverse? Then turn it on. Use a high-speed setting called puree, macrate, exquisite, etc. Run the blender for at least 30 seconds and stop it and let the contents settle. Observe them again. Are they diverse? Are they more or less diverse than they were before? If you perform this experiment properly, you will observe that before the experiment, the ice cream was variegated. Afterward, it was homogenized. There were distinct culinary states. That much is clear. But which would you characterize as more diverse? In its modern political meaning, diversity clearly refers to a state of homogenization. Your organization is diverse in as much as its percentage of various racial groups matches the percentage in the blender as a whole. In a properly diversified society, there are no big blobs of strawberry or chunky monkey. The blend is uniform and uniformly distributed. Now, isn't that interesting? Don't you think most people in the benighted past, lacking our advanced modern understanding of diversity, which dates, to be exact, to 1978, would have described the ice cream as more diverse before you turn the blender on? Perhaps this is just a strange word usage, an invention to be precise. To qualify as actual corruption, diversity has to have a real meaning which has nothing to do with ice cream, and which cannot be admitted openly, lest all and sundry react in fear, shock, and horror. Well, one thing that we do know is that Moldbug doesn't always give us the real definition of words. Let's look up the definition of diversity. Comes from, means quality of being diverse, fact of difference between two or more things or kinds, variety, separatedness, that in which two or more things differ, mostly in a natural sense. From the old French diversité, difference, diversity, unique features, oddness. Latin diversitatium, contrariety, contradiction, disarrangement. So that's the etymological roots of the word, which would seem to indicate that everything before the blender was diverse. So, interesting. Let's see. Yeah. Ice cream aside, the modern meaning of diversity is not concealed at all. Diversity means the official and officially regulated institution should grant distinctive privileges to persons of certain races. It has not one, but two formal meanings. The first formal meaning of diversity, which is the meaning Lewis Powell invented in 1978, and is still the legal meaning in the United States, is that a racially blended environment is intangibly essential to the development of personal character, and thus can and should be encouraged in institutions of every sort. We all know what is really meant by this, and I don't think Moldbug has the understanding to figure this out. It should be encouraged at all institutions because they can't organize against the leadership. Okay, again, go back to the Whole Foods heat map. Any place of business that they own that's at risk of unionizing, they diversify. Oldest trick in the book. Slave owners did it in the Caribbean where they would mix in Africans from different tribes. That's the real reason. But of course, you just can't say that. Development of personal character sounds so much better than just, we're going to keep all the slaves scared and confused. We saw this again with Carthage, where Polybius reports how the mercenaries are from all these different countries and religions, and so the Carthaginians could more easily control them. That's the real purpose of diversity. Because Moldbug is going to tell you it serves no purpose. Why are they doing this? Well, it does serve a purpose. The second formal meaning of diversity, which is generally illegal in the U.S., but is often assumed to be legal, like driving 75 on the 101 or smoking weed at a Fish concert, is that granting privileges to persons of certain races is essential to a fair and just society because it compensates for past events in which large penalties were inflicted on a similar racial basis. Since these past injustices appear to have a permanent mark on our society, as measured by various statistical imbalances, justice demands an attempt to compensate for them. I will let these formal meanings stand. They are what they are. You believe them or you don't. Surely anyone reading this blog has been exhaustively exposed to both. And I'm sure nothing I could say could make either of them more or less credible. Rather, I think the more interesting way to explore the hypothesis of corruption is to take it as a given and to ask, supposing diversity has a real meaning, what might that be? Well, I've already said, it's to keep the workforce divided, confused, and at war with itself. But let's see what Moldbug says. To this end, allow me to borrow another trick from Lev Navrazov, which is to discuss patterns of official favoritism by using the word Aryan for groups relatively favored by the authorities, and the tribe for groups relatively disfavored by the authorities. I'm aware this is flirting with Godwin's law. Flirting? I mean, at this point, guys, I think Moldbug has been going steady with Godwin's law for the last 16 years, but, can he help it? Actually, if you knew my real name and you'd search the archives, lovers around 1991-92, you would find all sorts of violent flame wars between Mike Godwin and the teenage Mencius, none of whose content I recall in the slightest. I never much liked Godwin, and I can say the same for Godwin's law. NS, after all, was one of the great corrupt philosophical systems of the 20th century. Surely, if we are interested in patterns of official corruption, it makes no sense to exclude this treasure trove of case studies. The mid-20th century Germans is especially useful because it is A, defunct and thus mostly harmless, and B, most closely relates to universalism than any other great tyranny, Marxism, which is at least a sibling and maybe even a branch of universalism. But remember everybody, as of You Can Only Lose the Culture War, apparently this the second coming of Mean Mr. Mustache is right around the corner because, the Republicans are just in bed with these guys. How Moldbug has changed. So with Navrazov's transformation and normalizing synonyms to diversity, here is a recent story from the San Francisco Chronicle, August 22nd, 2007. The California Supreme Court took up its diversity case in almost 7 years today. First diversity case in almost 7 years today, agreeing to decide the legality of San Francisco's program that grants preferences for Aryan contractors. The court granted a hearing on appeals by two companies. They say the city ordinance violates Proposition 209, the 1996 initiative that outlawed Aryan preference in public contracting, employment, and education. A Superior Court judge overturned the ordinance in 2004, but a state appeals court ruled in April that the city might be able to justify diversity despite Prop 209 if it could show that the program were needed to counteract a history of discrimination. In that case, the appeals court said Prop 209 might be overridden by the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of equal protection of the laws. San Francisco has programs to increase Aryan share of city contracts since 1984 and has faced continual legal challenges from Jewish contractors. The current ordinance passed in 2003 gives Aryan-owned companies a 10% advantage over competitive bids. It also requires contractors to hire a certain percentage of subcontracting firms that are not owned by Jews or to show they have made a good faith effort to meet these goals. In hearings that led to the passage of the ordinance, the city's Human Rights Commission reports that companies owned by Aryans were substantially underrepresented in city contracts despite 2 decades of diversity. The commission found evidence that city staffers had failed to enforce diversity and had unfairly blamed Aryan-owned firms for delays in projects. It also said some Jewish contractors had violated or tried to evade the subcontracting requirements. The ordinance has been suspended since the Superior Court ruling in 2004. The case is being closely watched by local governments. Proposition 209 was upheld by the Federal Appeals Court in 1997. In November 2000, the state Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the initiative barred state and local outreach programs that recruited Aryan companies for government contracts, even if the companies were not given any bidding preferences. What's especially nice about the Navrazov transformation is that you can apply it to the entire argument for and against diversity. For example, a defender of diversity might argue that diversity is necessary because it of an easily demonstrated pattern of economic and political domination by Jews. His opponent might respond that the statistical imbalances, while they certainly exist, are not the evidence of Jewish criminality, and thus fair cause for a system of compensation in which the Jews must pay back their ill-gotten gains to the Aryans. They have obviously victimized, but rather evidence of some biological advantage of the Jews, which naturally makes them more successful than Aryans in our modern globalized economy. Endless fun can be had with this game. Well, I mean, what he's trying to do is trying to make fun of both sides here, because he's saying on the left, if you reduce what they're saying, Sargon did something like this on his YouTube channel years later, where he's like, is this far right or is this like wokeism? And he had like these statements and you had to fill in the blanks. Or he switched words around creatively. And here he's, flexing that, the whites are being replaced. Which again, this guy's alt-right how? I'm still trying to figure out how he's alt-right. But it hasn't really brought us any closer to establishing the real meaning of diversity. It is just an invidious comparison. We are all familiar with the ways in which one corrupt regime used racial bean counting as a political tool. However, our society is so different from the 1930s Germany that we'd expect the analogy to fall apart on closer look, which it obligingly does. For example, Jews were a minority in Germany, at least if the general population is considered, rather than the greasy hook-nosed bankers, and they are a majority in our society, or at least if you consider that society is just America and Europe, rather than the planet as a whole. Of course, the supporters of diversity would consider the planet as a whole, but let's forget that for the moment. An interesting clue, however, is provided by a passage in a little book called Freedom, Forgotten, and Remembered, 1943, by one Helmut Kuhn. Kuhn himself is quite forgotten, at least so far as Lewicki knows, but here is his bio from the back cover. Born in Liebling, Silesia in 1899, Helmut Kuhn joined the German army in 1914 and served as an officer from 1915 to 1919. After returning to civilian life, he studied languages, history, philosophy at Breslau, Innsbruck, and Berlin, receiving his PhD in 1923. In 1930, he was appointed lecturer on philosophy at the University of Berlin and secretary of the Kant Society and International Association. In the following years, he taught philosophy and published a book on Socrates and other philosophical works. At the same time, he participated in the political life of the capital and came in contact with the leaders of the Republic. With Mustache Man's advent to power in 1933, Mr. Kuhn joined the militant group which, under Pastor Niemöller, resisted the mid-20th century Germanization of Christianity, but opposition to the all-powerful NS regime soon became a forlorn hope. The Kant Society was coordinated Gleichschaltet, and the universities were forced into public alignment. A research award for the study of British Hegelianism granted to Mr. Kuhn by the German Academy at Munich afforded a welcome opportunity to go abroad, and he left Germany for good. After a brief stay in England, he came to this country to complete the history of aesthetics, a work on which he collaborated with Professor K.E. Gilbert of Duke University. Subsequently, he was invited to join the philosophy department at the University of North Carolina. I would expect Professor Kuhn to have some fascinating thoughts on NS, wouldn't you? Well, he does, and here's one of them. Under the Republic, an almost unlimited frankness in public utterances was tolerated, and a considerable confusion of the mind, unfeigned and unabashed, was bared to everyone's inspection. Under the dictatorship, only one idea of political and philosophical relevance could be safely expressed. As a result, public utterances became uniform, and in the same proportion insincere. The land was infested with lies, ranging all the way from the successful self-deception that blurs the distinctions between good faith and fraud, through the many shades and degrees of hypocrisy and opportunism to the full-fledged, deliberate, and so to speak, honest lie. The way in which the new dishonesty expressed itself was equally varied. There was the omission of words which otherwise had been uttered, a mere inflection of the voice, an ambiguous turn of phrase, a subtle innuendo, or the indispensable lifting of the hand for the Mustache Man salute. And again, there was the blatant opportunism of those whom the popular voice called a more than 100% NS. The change of minds overnight. Hold on a second. It's one of these. No, okay, it's not as long as I thought. Overnight. The betrayal of ancient loyalties, just as a single concession seemed puny and too insignificant to deserve the name of a lie, the habit of insincerity like a contagious disease infected the whole body of a national life. You are going to publish a book. See to it that the references to the works by the tribe are discarded. You are a banker. You will have to add at least one party member to the managing board. Mr. S. will retire if you do so. Well, considering his former political affiliations, this may be good. This may be good sense on his part. You are a journalist. Practice Tehranol's art of using words which conceal your thought rather than revealing it. And whatever and whosoever you are, stop being an over-scrupulous stickler, or else you will court disaster for yourself without doing good to anyone else. And if you cannot help singing out of tune, do so under your breath. A putrid, slimy layer of lies was suspended over all domains and phrases of German life. Language was adulterated and depraved. The ring of candor, kindliness, and generosity seemed to have gone out of the words which the new propaganda had mustered for its purposes. Now that's interesting. Now isn't that interesting? Doesn't that remind you of a few things? Did you happen to focus in on the same sentence I did? You will have to add at least one party member to the managing board. Well, of course Moldbug would pick that. But this whole paragraph describes modern-day America under the techno-woke dictatorship. Like everything Moldbug said he was opposed to, the empire of lies, the insincerity, the lying, all of this comes from the corporations trying to, again, who gave us the sex revolution? Rockefeller, Kinsey. All of this stuff. It's like, okay, bro. Okay. I feel like we're starting to get a little warm here. Do you feel like we're getting warm? Does this maybe ring a distant, far-off bell on some ancient, long-disused, and deeply sleepy, but not quite perfectly anesthetized or atrophied lobe of your cerebrum? The problem with the simple Navrazov transformation is that while the mid-20th century Germans were clearly run by Aryans, the United States is clearly not run by Aryans. I don't know what the circle of power and privilege looks like. It bears a remarkable resemblance to the customer base of Burning Man. Suffice it to say that an Aryan burner is enough to the Rara Avis to deserve his own column inch in the Quran. However, if we think of diversity as not a racial power tool, but a political power tool, it starts to make a good deal more sense. Certainly not every party member is an Aryan, but most of them, in fact, are not. Nor is it absolutely guaranteed that every single Aryan will be a party member, but most of them, in fact, are. Moreover, for the last 30 years or so, our universities, which are certainly quite well coordinated, at least if the standard of coordination is diversity, have been in the business of operating Aryan studies programs. These happen to bear remarkable resemblance to party training, and since diversity by definition means that the average Aryan is less qualified than his or her fellow students, the attraction of Aryan studies is obvious, further increasing the identity of Aryan with Partio Jones. I mean, this whole like crude joke falls apart because the NS regime didn't want diversity, it wanted homogeneity. And again, Moldbug is still missing the point creatively, as he always does. Moreover, one of the interesting phenomena that accompanies diversity is sensitivity. Perhaps the real meaning of sensitivity is that it's professionally quite imprudent to sing out of tune within the auditory sphere of a party member, which might explain why it's so important to have a homogeneous distribution of party members in each and every walk of life, including diversity training, which under this hypothesis is in fact political education, conveniently brought to you in the workplace in case you happen to miss this vital educational experience. Furthermore, this hypothesis, which let's not forget is only a hypothesis, also explains why all American universities, even private ones, which could easily find ways to shirk or duck their diversity responsibilities, are so eager to pursue more multicultural students. Right, Moldbug. It's because it's control. He acts like all of this is an imposition on corporate America by the government, when it's completely ass backwards. It's an imposition on the government by corporate America because they want to break the back of the unions. Up until 1980, all socialist parties were opposed to immigration. It's just, I mean, everything is backwards with Moldbug. What universities really care about is their power and status. They want alumni whose path to the top will be greased, and who better than the Aryans? So this is the hypothesis. It's only a hypothesis, just a thought, man. You can think of it for a little while, then say nah and go back to a formal meaning 1 or 2. It won't hurt you at all. Except that's not the meaning of diversity. Look it up. It means to have a collection of different things. It's the problem about use definition. That's why I hate use definition of words, because it turns into what Moldbug put in the blender at the beginning of this essay. Try not to do it when there aren't any party members around, though. And it's important to note that if diversity really is best understood as a political power tool, It certainly doesn't imply that those who promote diversity understand this at all. Au contraire, all the best disinformation is unconscious. Conscious conspiracies happen, but they are rare and tend to be small. Belief in the formal meanings of diversity is widespread, and as far as I can tell, it's perfectly sincere. However, there's another simple and accurate corruption test that diversity fails. We'll call it the ogre test, after this little ditty by W.H. Auden in 1968. The ogre does what ogres can, deeds quite impossible for man, but one deed is beyond his reach, the ogre cannot master speech. About a subject plain, among the desperate and slain, the ogre stalks with hand on hips, with drivel gushes from his lips. If you need an example to demonstrate this result, you may not live on the same plane as me. Well, I'm beginning to wonder if Moldbug is the ogre. He seems to have a hard time mastering speech. All right, let's see what we have in the chat tonight. Anything worth, any interesting, funny takes? Censored Anon, this guy's style of writing is so weird. Yeah, it's schizoid. It's basically schizoid. Okay, let's see. Cyber Ninja Zero, hello. Let's see. But no, and all these tech jobs are coming to an end soon. Yep, AI will get you. Censored Anon, AI gets us scorched earth, and I couldn't be happy. Huh? Yeah, wow. Oh. John Brown, hello. Let's see. I would purge all Chaw King 666. I would purge all NGOs as a supreme democratic facilitator. But no, and if the Fed ever went rogue, they could wipe out all banks with a chain that Bitcoin banks are just a middleman. Chogokin 666, I think Russia is proving that autocracy, which is economic self-sufficiency, at least in the military sense, is proving a successful strategy as opposed to the Atlanticist system. Well, the Atlanticist system is breaking down due to supply chain disruptions. So, no, and I hope Russia is successful, but false hope and catastrophism runs rampant in today's society. Yeah. Nathan C.J. Hood, hello. Minoan, what one thinks is true today will be seen as delusional in 15 years, many such cases. Ah, yes, Minoan. Well, you have to take it on faith, but 15 years ago, stuff that I said is now coming true. So, just saying. Heck, even 5 years ago. Let's see. Mutant number 12. Streams make me glad I went from Berkeley to San Francisco and skipped over most of this. Oh, Buckley to San Francisco. Yeah. Wait. Mutant number 12. Esoteric critique of lactose intolerance. Wow. Nice. Hello. Truth Stream Media and 999 Duke are both streaming ATM. Okay, well, maybe that explains some things. Well, everyone, this next article will be quite long, and we will leave this for next week. Thank you, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.